Henry Thompson seemed to live a life that many could only dream of. A successful construction business allowed him and his family to lead a comfortable, even luxurious life in a small but cozy town in Oregon. All neighbors knew Henry as a man solid, polite, and helpful. He built his business from scratch and managed to become an example for many who knew him in his youth. However, behind the facade of an impeccable husband and successful businessman hid a soul that gradually began to deteriorate. Henry had been married to Linda for 10 years. She became his second wife when he was just over 40. Linda was 5 years younger than him, a beautiful and elegant woman, always friendly and caring. She had a daughter from a previous marriage, Cassandra, or as she was called in the family, Cassie. Henry hit it off immediately, and although he was not officially her father, their relationship was always warm and seemingly harmonious. They lived in a spacious house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall pines and green meadows, where peace and quiet reigned. Cassie had recently returned home after graduating from university. During her years in the big city, she had changed from a naive girl to a confident young woman with a special magnetism. Her long black hair, bright eyes, and refined manners attracted the attention of men wherever she appeared. It seemed that Cassie had become a whole new personality that Henry had never fully known. Linda, not noticing no change in her daughter's character, was genuinely excited about her return. In her eyes, it was an opportunity to reconnect with her family, especially after Cassie had lived away from home for several years. Linda did her best to create a comfortable environment for her daughter, to support her in finding a job, to take care of her future. Soon, however, strange changes began to occur in the house. At first it was small things. Henry began to notice that Cassie often held her gaze on him longer than usual. Her touches, casual as they seemed, became a little more prolonged. She looked at him with a kind of hidden challenge, and those looks made Henry uneasy. He couldn't figure out what was behind it, but he couldn't ignore it either. One day he caught himself thinking of her not as a stepdaughter, but as a woman. He was ashamed of such thoughts and tried to chase them away, but it didn't always succeed. As the weeks passed, the tension between them began to build. It was like Cassie was toying with him, making him feel awkward and embarrassed. She came into his office on various pretexts, lingering over breakfast when Linda was away on business, leaving the two of them alone. At such moments, Henry felt that something was wrong, that it was out of the ordinary in the family. But at the same time, he began to notice that her presence made him not only uncomfortable, but also strangely, dangerously attracted to her. One day Cassie came a little too close to him. It was the evening Linda had gone to a friend's house. Henry was sitting in the living room working on his laptop. Cassie came into the room, sat across from him, and started saying something about an upcoming job interview. He tried not to look at her, concentrating on the screen, but her voice and soft intonations distracted him. Suddenly she stood up and came up behind him and put her hand on his shoulder. "You've always been like a father to me," she whispered, leaning in slightly so her lips were close to his ear. Henry shuddered. He wanted to get up, to move away, but his body seemed to freeze in place as Cassie leaned closer and her lips touched his neck, briefly, barely perceptibly. But it was enough to make his heart beat faster. He stood up abruptly, trying to pull away. But there was no embarrassment in Cassie's eyes, only defiance and a strange sense of triumph. "Cassie," Henry said, his voice trembling. This isn't right." She smiled, fixing her hair. "What's right about it?" she answered quietly, her gaze remaining piercing and confident. "We both know that something has changed. Why not just accept it?" Henry tried to brush off her words, but they had already penetrated deep into his mind. He couldn't sleep for a long time that night, thinking about what had happened. His mind struggled with guilt and desire, but every memory of Cassie's gaze and touch increased the temptation. Linda didn't notice anything. She was still minding her own business, trusting Henry, and thinking he was the perfect husband. She had no idea what was going on in his head, or what was going on in her own home where such dangerous passions were playing out. As a few more weeks passed, Henry began to realize that things were getting out of control. Cassie began to appear around him more and more often, her innuendos becoming more explicit. He was finding it harder and harder to resist her presence. She seemed to him the embodiment of something forbidden and attractive at the same time. Henry couldn't tell if it was her youth, her confidence, or her power over him that attracted him. But as each day passed, he sank deeper into these dangerous thoughts, and it seemed there was no turning back. He began looking for ways to distance himself from her, spending more time at work, avoiding long conversations. But it wasn't working. It was as if Cassie sensed his weakness and only intensified her attempts. Her game was getting more and more dangerous. Henry was on edge, balancing his sense of duty with a temptation that seemed increasingly irresistible. This tension hung invisibly over the house while Linda, unsuspecting, continued to live her normal life. It seemed only a matter of time before something would shatter this delicate balance. Henry could no longer deny the obvious. What had started out as an innocent attraction was turning into a dangerous game, with Cassie dictating the rules. He felt cornered, caught between two fires, his duty to Linda and his rapidly developing bond with Cassie, which was growing stronger and harder to hide every day. Every time he was around Linda, guilt came over him like a wave, but when he was alone with Cassie, those feelings instantly faded, giving way to a feeling of entrapment. He tried to resist at first. After Cassie first touched him and made her intentions clear, Henry tried to avoid her. He even began to distance himself from his family, spending more time at work, delaying meetings with his partners, and finding any excuse not to be home. But Cassie continued her onslaught, subtly manipulating situations to get alone with him. Her confidence and assertiveness were both terrifying and admirable to Henry. It seemed to him that he was no longer in control of the situation, but merely adrift, driven by her desires. He justified his behavior on the grounds that their liaison was harming no one, that Linda would never know, and therefore, she would not suffer. With each new encounter with Cassie, his excuses became more and more elaborate. Linda, however, was not as naive as Henry thought. She had always thought of herself as an intuitive woman, with a knack for noticing the little things. It was those little things that were beginning to worry her. She couldn't say exactly what went wrong, but something in the behavior of her husband and daughter began to change. At first, it was fleeting moments, the glances they would throw at each other when they thought Linda couldn't see. Then there were strange conversations behind closed doors when Cassie went into Henry's office, and they would whisper about something for long periods of time. Linda tried not to pay much attention to it. She explained to herself that Cassie and Henry had always had a good relationship, that they were close, and there was nothing suspicious about it. But something inside her insisted that it was more than that. Anxiety, like a worm, crept into her thoughts and began gradually to gnaw at her from the inside. Sitting in the living room one evening, Linda saw Cassie, dressed in a short dress, slip easily into Henry's study. They didn't close the door, but Linda noticed Henry's eyes linger on his daughter's legs for a moment before returning to his own business. Linda turned away as if to chase away the unpleasant picture that was rapidly emerging in her mind. "It's not true," she urged herself. But suspicion was growing, albeit unconsciously. While Linda tried to fight her thoughts, Cassie savored her new power. Not only did she have Henry in her hands, but she had control of the entire situation. She knew how much he was captivated by her, and it intoxicated her. Young, beautiful, confident in her attractiveness, Cassie played the role of seductress with devilish ease. She wasn't satisfied with the passive role of a lover hidden from view. She wanted more attention, more gifts, more recognition. Henry, despite his inner torment, could not resist her. Every demand she made he took as a challenge, and the more she demanded, the more he sank into this forbidden passion. Cassie didn't hesitate to use her influence, manipulating Henry through his fears and weaknesses. She gradually squeezed gifts out of him. Jewelry, expensive outfits, even offered to pay for a trip, to which he, after much hesitation, agreed. One evening when Linda went to meet her friends, Cassie took advantage of the moment again. She walked into Henry's office and closed the door behind her. "You've been too tense lately, Henry," she said, walking over to his desk and resting her hands on it. Her gaze was piercing, confident. Henry looked up and met her gaze. He knew where this conversation was leading, and again he felt a shiver go through his body. "I can't, Cassie," he said quietly, trying to keep control of himself. "This has gone too far." Cassie grinned, tilting her head to the side. You say that every time, and then you give in anyway. We crossed that line a long time ago." Her voice was quiet, but each phrase hammered through his mind like the blows of a hammer. Henry tried to get up, but Cassie moved forward, covering him in the chair with her body. "Linda won't know anything," she added, her voice turning to a whisper. "This is our secret, and it will remain a secret if you continue to play by my rules." Henry realized that he was completely entangled in her web. He couldn't fight it anymore. He had become a hostage to his own desires and weaknesses, and Cassie was well aware of that. She knew how to use his fears to her advantage. Every time Henry tried to distance himself, she brought him back to her, manipulating his guilt and enticing him with new prospects. But Cassie was not only a seductress, she was also a manipulator. She began to express ideas more and more often that frightened Henry. One night at dinner, when Linda had gone to the other room, she leaned over to him and whispered, "What if we told her the truth?" Henry turned pale. He knew it would be the end of everything. Linda would never forgive him for cheating on her, even with her own daughter. "You're crazy," he whispered back, trying not to look into her eyes. "Do you realize how this could end?" But Cassie just smiled. "Of course I do, but sometimes taking risks is the only way to make a difference." Every day she became more and more demanding. She wasn't satisfied with their hidden connection. She wanted more acceptance, more openness. Henry became more and more withdrawn, his nerves on edge. Every time he looked at Linda, his mind conjured up dark images of what might happen if she knew the truth. It seemed to him that he was slowly but surely heading for disaster. Linda, meanwhile, was increasingly noticing that something had changed in the house. She saw Cassie becoming more confident, her attitude toward Henry becoming more and more strange. She couldn't pick up on specific details, but she could feel the tension that hung in the air every time they were together. Linda tried to talk to Henry several times, but he only waved her off, saying he was tired because of work. One evening, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, Linda stared out the window for a long time, thinking about her marriage. She tried to understand what had happened to their family. Why had Henry become so aloof? Why was her own daughter acting so strangely? Small details began to add up, but Linda pushed those thoughts away, not wanting to believe what she was seeing. The last few days had been a nightmare for Henry. He could no longer pretend to be in control of the situation. Every morning he woke up with a heavy weight on his soul, feeling like his world was crumbling. He realized that his relationship with Cassie had gone too far, that sooner or later it was going to end in disaster. And the more he tried to avoid that thought, the stronger the feeling became that there was no going back. Cassie, who not so long ago had been the epitome of youth and passion to him, now seemed a threat. She had changed. She was no longer playing the role of submissive lover. Now she wanted to run his life. She wanted recognition. She wanted more attention. And most importantly, she wanted him to leave Linda. Each time they met, her demands became more insistent, and Henry felt his life begin to crumble under the pressure. One evening, when Linda had left again to visit her friends, Cassie showed up in his office, as she had done so many times before. But this time, Henry was ready. He couldn't go on with this affair any longer. Fear of exposure, guilt before Linda, and the horror that Cassie could ruin their lives had crowded out any feelings he had once had for her. "We need to talk." His voice was quiet but firm. He sat at his desk, fingers tapping nervously on the surface as if trying to find the strength for what he was about to say. Cassie, as always, was confident. She stepped closer, her lips curving slightly into a smile. "You're not in the mood, Henry," she said, leaning closer, her voice full of seduction. "I thought you'd be glad to see me." But Henry remained motionless. He raised his eyes to hers and met her gaze squarely for the first time in a long time. "We have to end this," he said, feeling his heart clench. "It's gone too far. I can't take it anymore." Cassie frowned. Her expression instantly changed from playful to cold. "Do you want to finish?" she repeated with a sneer. "You think you can just end it like that?" Henry felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected her reaction to be so harsh. "Yes," he answered firmly. "This is wrong. It was wrong from the start." Cassie took a step back, her eyes glittering with rage. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice rising. "It was a mistake to trust you. You think I'm going to let you just get rid of me like that? You think Linda will never find out?" She leaned forward, her face now only a few inches from his. "If you think you can leave me, you're sorely mistaken. I'll tell her everything, every detail, and we'll see how she reacts." Henry felt his panic starting to kick in. He couldn't let her do this. Linda didn't deserve this. He realized that he had trapped himself, and now there was no way out. "Cassie, please!" His voice became pleading. "It would ruin everything. We can't do this." But Cassie wasn't going to stop. Her eyes blazed with anger, and her voice became harsh and cold. "I'm not going to be your plaything anymore, Henry. Either you leave Linda, or I'll tell her myself." He looked at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. In that moment, he realized that she wouldn't stop. She was willing to destroy everything he had in order to get hers. Linda got home later than usual. The evening with her friends had gone well, but she still felt something was wrong. She ate dinner without appetite, and her thoughts kept returning to the strange changes in the house. She had tried several times to talk to Henry about his behavior, but each time he avoided serious conversation, citing fatigue or problems at work. That evening, upon returning home, Linda noticed that the house was strangely quiet. Cassie was usually watching TV or busy with her chores at this hour, but tonight, she was nowhere to be seen. Henry had disappeared as well. Linda climbed the stairs, went to the door of Cassie's room and knocked gently. "Cassie?" she called out, but there was no answer. Linda felt anxiety rising in her chest. She pulled on the doorknob and cautiously opened the door. What she saw made her heart sink. Cassie was lying on the floor, her body twisted like a doll thrown to the floor. Linda cried out and ran over to her daughter, kneeling down next to her motionless body. "Cassie?" Her voice trailed off into a scream. "Cassie, wake up!" She shook her, but realized it was useless. The cold reality crashed down on her with incredible force. Her daughter was dead. Linda couldn't believe what was happening. She sat on the floor next to Cassie's body, her hands shaking and her heart breaking with pain. The world around her had collapsed in an instant. Henry arrived home an hour after Linda. He was in a meeting with the partners when he received a disturbing call from Linda, her voice barely audible over her sobs. Henry immediately rushed home, feeling his fears becoming a reality. When he entered the house and saw Linda sitting on the floor next to Cassie's body, he felt time stand still. Cassie was dead. It all seemed unreal, as if from a horrible dream from which he could never wake up. "Linda," he murmured, sinking down beside his wife. She didn't answer. Her eyes were full of horror and pain. She stared at her daughter as if trying to realize that this was really happening. Henry didn't know what to say. He felt horrible, but at the same time, fear was growing in him. "What happened?" he asked, trying to take Linda's hand. "I don't know." Her voice was weak and broken. "I came in and she was already dead. Somebody killed her, Henry. Someone had killed our daughter." Henry felt everything inside him clench. His heart was pounding so hard he felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. His mind was racing with thoughts. Who could it be? A thief, a random intruder? Or was it someone they knew? But the main thought that kept him going was, would their secret come out? Would Linda find out what had happened between him and Cassie? The house quickly filled with police officers and investigators. Linda sat on the living room couch, still in shock, while Henry tried to stay close to her, trying not to show his nervousness. The detectives were interviewing them, trying to piece together a picture of what had happened. "Are you sure no one went into the house?" one of the police officers asked, addressing Henry. "Yes, I was in a meeting, and Linda, she was at her friend's," Henry replied, feeling his voice shaking. "We don't know what happened. We just found her. That's how." The policeman nodded and wrote something down in his notebook. Henry could hardly contain himself from panicking. He knew they would have to answer a lot of questions, but he was willing to do whatever it took to keep his and Cassie's connection from coming up. Two feelings fought inside him: horror at her death and relief that maybe this would all be over and the truth wouldn't come out. Linda, still sitting on the couch in shock, hugged the pillow, staring into the void. She was far from guessing what was really connecting Henry and her daughter, and was in a state of deep shock. During the night, the house was unbearably quiet. The policeman left, leaving behind only mounting questions and chaos in Linda's soul. Henry slowly made his way up the stairs to their bedroom, but couldn't find the strength to get into bed. Everything that was happening was too unreal, and the fear that the investigation might reveal something more didn't let him go for a moment. As he entered the room where Cassie had been found, a wave of memories came over him. Their forbidden connection, the passion he'd wanted so much to hide, had now become the source of his torment. He closed the door and went back downstairs, sitting on the edge of the couch next to Linda. Her trembling hands tried to squeeze his palm, but Henry couldn't reciprocate. His soul was already torn apart. He tried to whisper something soothing, but the words wouldn't come out. Their family idol was shattered forever. Now only suspicion, grief, and the shadow of irreversible tragedy remained in the house. The murderer had yet to be found, but as Henry sensed, this was only the first step toward an even more terrible truth. A long, agonizing investigation lay ahead of them. When Detective Carolyn Hunt entered the Thompson family home, her keen senses immediately picked up the subtle tensions that permeated the air. This wasn't just a place of tragedy. Here, in every corner, she sensed a mystery that had yet to be solved. Carolyn had been with the Oregon State Police for over 20 years and had seen many murders, but something about this situation alarmed her more than usual. There were too many ifs and too few answers. Her partner, Josh Myers, had only recently been promoted to detective. This was his first high-profile case, and he was trying to stay cool, even though he could feel his heart racing with every step. Carolyn wasn't one to trust the intuition of inexperienced colleagues, but Josh was a quick study and heeded her every advice. When they entered the living room, Henry was sitting on the couch, pale, with a blank stare. Linda sat motionless beside him, her face frozen in an expression of loss. Both looked like a couple that time had taught to live in silence with each other, but now their world was shattered. Carolyn looked around the room, trying to recreate the last hours of Cassie's life in her head. As always, it was important to start with the facts. The medical examiner had determined that the girl had been strangled. There were no signs of a struggle, which meant that the killer had either caught her off guard or she knew him. That immediately ruled out a random attack or robbery. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Thompson," Carolyn spoke calmly, "we understand how difficult this is for you right now, but we need to ask some questions to understand what happened." Henry nodded without raising his eyes. Linda, on the other hand, was ready to speak. Her voice trembled, but she held on. "We'll answer whatever we need to. Please find whoever did this to our little girl," Linda said, barely holding back tears. Carolyn began asking the standard questions. When they had last seen Cassie, who was at home, if there had been an intruder in the house the night before. "What was her mood like lately?" Hunt asked. "Was there any conflict, any tension?" Henry, for the first time in a while, finally intervened. "No conflicts," he said quickly. "Cassie was happy. She'd just graduated, come home. She had no enemies." The words sounded too confident, and Carolyn froze for a moment, trying to catch the slightest emotion in his voice. Henry was clearly trying to suggest something. Perhaps he was just overwhelmed with grief, but there was a certain artificiality to his answers. He was trying too hard to look flawless. "Understood," Carolyn nodded, writing down his words. "What about her friends, former classmates? Maybe there were some people she'd come in contact with recently?" "She had friends from the university, but we didn't know much about them," Linda answered. Cassie had lived there for a few years, and she hadn't talked to anyone much since she'd come back. She spent more time at home. "We'll talk to her contacts," Carolyn said. "We'll need to get access to her phone and computer. It might help us figure out who she's been in touch with lately." Meanwhile, Josh was looking around Cassie's room. It was a typical young woman's living quarters. Posters on the walls, books, a laptop on the desk, neatly folded clothes. Nothing suspicious at first glance. He opened the laptop, but it was password protected. "We'll need to hack into it," Josh said, turning back to Hunt. "Give it to the tech department. If there's anything important on there, they'll find it," she replied. They looked around the house and talked to the neighbors, but nothing that could point to suspicious individuals came up. The investigation had reached a dead end. A few days passed, and Hunt and Myers gathered more information about Cassie's life. They learned that she had strained relationships with several people at the university. especially an ex-boyfriend who had recently tried to reconnect with her. This trail could be promising, but again, nothing concrete. Myers met with Cassie's ex-boyfriend, but the latter seemed genuinely upset about her death and had no alibi for the time of the murder. "It feels like all the tracks lead nowhere," Josh said irritably when they got back to the station. "We've interviewed her friends, looked at all her contacts, but no one looks suspicious. Maybe we're missing something?" Carolyn looked thoughtfully at the computer screen where the photos from the Thompson house were popping up. "We're missing something important," she murmured, "and that something is inside this family. Do you think Henry's hiding something? He's nervous, but this isn't just ordinary grief. He's afraid something might come to the surface. I can't say exactly what, but there's something about his reaction that keeps me on edge." Myers nodded, agreeing with his partner. He'd seen Hunt intuitively sense the subtleties in people's behavior before. That instinct had never failed her. "Let's put some pressure on him," he suggested. Maybe then he'd open up. When the detectives arrived at the Thompson house again, Henry looked even more tense. Carolyn noticed his hands clench into fists every time the conversation touched Cassie. "Mr. Thompson," Hunt began, looking intently at Henry, "it seems to us that you know more than you're saying. You have an opportunity to tell us everything right now. It might help the investigation considerably." Henry froze, his face pale. He tried to pull himself together, but every word he said became more and more strained. "Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about." His voice shook. "I've said all I can." "We understand what you're going through," Hunt said softly, but her gaze was hard. "But if you continue to hide the truth, it could play against you. I'm not saying you had anything to do with her death, but there's something you're afraid to tell us." Henry remained silent, avoiding her gaze. "Think about it, Mr. Thompson," she went on. "If there's something you want to hide, now is the time to come clean. We can help you, but only if you're honest." Linda, sitting next to her, looked anxiously at her husband. "Henry?" she asked quietly. He couldn't hide the truth any longer. Henry sat on the edge of the couch, his face grim and pale. After hours of questioning, he could no longer remain silent. Linda stood at the window, her hands clenched into fists as if she was ready to strike the glass. The tension in the room was building with every passing second. Detective Carolyn Hunt watched him closely, keeping her eyes on him. Josh Myers stood a little behind her, watching the scene, ready to pick up the conversation at any moment if Hunt demanded it. "Come on, Henry," Hunt said coldly. "I'd rather you tell the truth now than find yourself in an even worse situation later." Henry sighed, his face collapsing under the weight of the impending confession. "Yeah." His voice shook, and he closed his eyes. "I was having an affair with Cassie." Linda turned sharply toward him, her eyes full of disbelief and fury. As if a stroke of thunder tore through the room, her voice pierced the silence. "You said what?" Linda looked at him as if she didn't recognize him. Henry couldn't look her in the eye. "Linda, I didn't mean for things to go this far. It was a mistake. Cassie, she was seductive. I didn't mean to ruin us. I loved you." Her face contorted in pain. She took a few steps back, trying to digest his words. "You slept with my daughter?" Her voice turned as cold as ice. "How could you?" Henry still didn't look up, avoiding her gaze. "I didn't kill her, Linda," he almost whispered. "It's the truth. You've already ruined everything, Henry." Her voice was quieter, but still full of anger and pain. "I don't believe a word you say." She turned and stalked out of the room, her footsteps resounding down the empty hallway. The detectives didn't stop her. Hunt looked at Henry carefully. "I believe you didn't kill her," she said slowly. "But that doesn't mean that whatever you did didn't play a part in what happened. Lies always surface." Back at the station, Hunt and Myers immersed themselves in analyzing the materials. In Hunt's hands was Cassie's laptop, which had remained unopened since her death. She exhaled and handed it to the technicians. "Check everything," she ordered, never taking her eyes off the screen. "We need any leads we can get." While they waited for the results, Myers studied all the previous records of Cassie's friends and acquaintances. One thing that was suspicious was her entourage over the past few months. She had been seeing a lot of Jared, an ex-boyfriend with whom they had had a rather tense breakup, according to eyewitnesses. Jared is coming back into the picture. Myers flipped through the papers. Their relationship didn't end well, and he didn't seem to be out of her life completely. Hunt nodded. So it wasn't just a breakup, she added. Maybe he wanted more than just a closed door. A few hours later, the results of the analysis of Cassie's laptop were ready. The specialists found several messages and emails that shed light on her dark side. There was correspondence with Jared discussing substances and risky gambling. The messages contained hidden hints about their past games with choking. Look at this. Hunt opened the screen to Myers. Let's make it even tougher next time. I think they were playing with fire. Myers frowned. Apparently their relationship wasn't as simple as it seemed. Drugs and violence were an explosive mix. Cassie had traces of a powerful opiate in her blood that suppressed pain sensations, Hunt said as she looked over the expert reports. That explains why she might have asked Jared to strangle her during sex. Maybe she just didn't realize how close to the edge she was. Hunt sighed and made a note. We need to talk to Jared again. Jared was brought in for a second interrogation. This time he came in without his former swagger. His face paled when Hunt showed him the correspondence with Cassie and the forensic results. We have evidence that you were with Cassie that night, Hunt said. We know that you took drugs and played games that proved fatal to her. Jared started to look around nervously, trying to find the words, but his voice betrayed him. It was her idea, he suddenly shouted out. She'd always asked me to strangle her. It was part of her fantasies. He shook his head, wiping sweat from his forehead. We used then, a little, as usual. It was going fine, but then she asked to do it again, like before. I did, but she stopped breathing. I didn't think it would go this far. Why didn't you call the police? Myers asked, his voice calm but firm. I was scared, Jared answered, his voice trailing off. I just didn't know what to do. It all happened so fast. I thought I was going to be charged with murder. Hunt paused, then stood up from the table and approached Jared. But you killed her, Jared, she said quietly. Whether it was intentional or accidental, and you're going to have to answer for that. Jared lowered his head. He knew there was no point in resisting anymore. When the detectives told Linda and Henry the truth, the atmosphere in the house was no less grave than it had been the previous days. Linda sat motionless, her eyes seemingly empty. Henry stood behind her, but they no longer looked at each other. Jared confessed, Hunt said calmly. He'd killed her accidentally in a drug-induced spree while they were having sex. He hadn't meant for it to end that way, but his fear and stupidity had led to the tragedy. Linda was silent. Her eyes were staring into the void, and she didn't react to the detective's words. Henry leaned toward her, but his voice sounded like a whisper in the void. Linda, he began. You don't have to say anything, Henry. Her voice was cold and detached. You've ruined everything we had. Now I don't care what you have to say. He recoiled, realizing there was no future left for them. Everything that had bound them together before had been destroyed by lies and betrayal. Linda slowly stood up and headed for the door, her footsteps sounding hollow, echoing in the room. Where are you going? He asked, but there was no answer. She simply walked out, leaving Henry alone in his ruined life, with the guilt that would now be his only companion. After everything that had happened, Henry and Linda's life would never go back to the way it was. Linda, after packing a few things, moved in with her sister in a neighboring town. She withdrew from contact with Henry, and their home, once filled with warmth and memories, was now associated only with pain and loss. Neighbors reported that Linda became withdrawn, rarely went outdoors, and had little contact with people. Consumed by grief and betrayal, she lost interest in her past life. Everything she had known and loved was shattered in an instant. Henry was left alone. He tried to continue working and get back to a normal life, but it seemed impossible. The guilt haunted him constantly. Treason, broken relationships, and Cassie's death were endless reminders to him that his mistakes had real and tragic consequences. He sold the house and moved into a small apartment where every night he agonized over how things could have been different. Jared was sentenced to several years in prison for manslaughter. For him, it was the end of a youth and freedom that once seemed endless. He wasn't a monster, but his rash actions had led to Cassie's death, and that fact would stay with him forever. Carolyn Hunt continued to work as a detective, but this case left a mark on her. She had seen too many lives destroyed, too many losses. With each investigation, she became more and more convinced that small mistakes and careless acts can tear lives apart. It reminded her that the truth always finds a way to surface, even if they try to hide it. Henry and Linda's story had become a local legend, a story of how secrets, lies, and selfishness could destroy everything people once thought was immutable. The moral was that the truth, no matter how cruel, is always better than a lie, because a lie eats away at the inside, not just the person who tells it, but everyone it touches.